Welcome again to ODSECS 31 and to Bethany Qualls, who will be talking to us about Sally Salisbury from sex work to coffin robbery. It is an absolute privilege to have her with us today. I first met Bethany when she organized an ASECS roundtable on hardcore heroines, the wonderfulness of which not even COVID could dampen. Bethany was the perfect chair for this topic, being something of a hardcore heroine herself. Her research bridges print and oral culture, gossip, and tea table nattering, and the development of celebrity culture. She has written on Aphra Behn and Eliza Haywood, and her early research on Sally Salisbury won the ASECS Catherine Macaulay Prize. Today's talk is part of her book project, Flying Reports, Fame and Fortune, Gossip Beyond Celebrity in 18th Century Print Culture. I'm now going to pass over to Nush Powell, who has a few additional words of introduction.
Hello, and everyone. Welcome to OddSex. And it is lovely to see such a fine roster of people here. I'm not at all surprised that Bethany was the one who drew us all together. So I'm guessing a lot of people in the audience already know what I'm about to say, which is that Bethany is, as she says, a scholar and an editor and a teacher and an all-around wonderful and brilliant person. I think I met her first through the context of Eliza Haywood, which is the best way to meet somebody that is going to be a brilliant part of your life moving forward. And I urge anyone who's not familiar with Bethany's work on Haywood to go and look it up, because she is a sharp thinker. And I knew that even back when she was in grad school. Like, I need to be following this person's work because it's going places. So I guess I would add, and Bethany can elaborate or not, she's an excellent writer and writing partner. And if you ever want to be involved in clandestine scholarly ventures, Bethany's the person you want to sign up for the expedition. She is charming and brilliant, and exactly the kind of forward-thinking scholarship that is keeping the 18th century so vital and so interesting to us today. So with that, I will stop talking, because who we want to hear from is Bethany.
Aw, thanks all. This is so exciting. Let me share my screen. All right, is that working? Can we see everything? We've all been doing Zoom for how long, and yet we're like, how does this work again? So thank you so much for coming to hear delightful things about Sally Salisbury from sex work to coffin robbery. Let's get into it. So it helps when you actually click the right button. This mezzotint is the most complete, detailed representation of the celebrated Sally Salisbury. It was made by John Smith in the style of renowned portrait painter Sir Godfrey Kneller. Yet, it is highly unlikely that this image looks like Salisbury at all. Instead, it consists of a mix of motifs found in late 17th century oil paintings of noblewomen by Kneller and William Wissing, which I'm happy to show you later if you're interested. Compare this version of Salisbury with that in the Rake's Rendezvous. There she is right there. She may be this bare-breasted woman smoking in this print of Tom's King's Coffee House, made somewhere around 1735, a decade after her death. This engraving derives from William Hogarth's The Rake's Progress and claims to be a faithful mirror of the wild disorder that happens in this well-known London coffee house, sex, puke, and all. These images give us just a taste of Sally Salisbury's many after images in the 1720s and beyond, pointing to bigger ideas like what makes up a reputation, the transmission of fame, and just who controls someone's narrative during their life or after their death. Today I'll be taking us through the many surprising contours of Salisbury's archive to think about early celebrity for someone who, as far as we know, did not seek to be the subject of so many media forms. Beyond the central intersections of fame, celebrity, profit, and reputation, we'll look at how those who create print objects leverage the lived experiences and stories of infamous people, particularly beyond traditional biographic modes. In other words, the growth of print culture throughout the 1700s changed the ways that fame was created and transmitted. Print culture, and by this I mean anything replicated by mechanical production, not just words on a page, created the conditions for what we can recognize as modern celebrity. Early social media forms like newspapers worked to both churn out the conditions of celebrity and help fix reputations and histories that can be accessed centuries later because they were written down and sometimes saved. I'm not trying to parse out just how famous Salisbury was in her lifetime or afterwards, but what makes her and others who we wouldn't say are famous still endure for centuries. So I argue that Sally Salisbury's printed traces demonstrate the uneasy coexistence of durable fame and temporary celebrity that continues throughout the deep 18th century via information commodification. Salisbury's ephemeral durability also shows where these understandings of fame and celebrity can break down, complicating ideas of cultural memory, what counts as history, and how these overlapping modes of transmission and reputation still operate to this day. But before we get to Salisbury's materials, let's do a quick gloss of some key concepts. The first, of course, is the uneasy coexistence of durable fame and temporary celebrity, which is just one way to try and parse these interrelated concepts. Leo Brody famously posits that celebrity is in the moment, fame on the cusp of the material and the immaterial. Meanwhile, Johnson's 1755 dictionary leads us back from one to the other, as celebrity means fame and fame means celebrity. So helpful. Fame, meanwhile, comes from this idea of fama, whose cognates and derivatives go way beyond what we think of as fame today. This concept contains our notions of public opinion, idle talk, rumor, reputation, information, news, infamy, and defamation. Rising to fame's heights, of course, brings risks of defamation. You can't fall if you don't go up. But fame, with its deep grounding as a concept, also brings the patina of historical significance, the durability of reputation and legacy. This is what Stella Tilliard calls a touch of immortality, of death, remembrance, and a place in history. So while fame often calls for uniqueness and singularity, celebrity, on the other hand, is temporary, refillable, and circulating. For Joseph Roach, images of celebrities circulate in their absence. We also have a variety of refillable social roles and repeated histories. Kevin Burke underlines celebrities' need for speed and its myopic focus on the present moment. It is a condition of the here and the now. Lastly, as a time frame for all this analysis, I look to Joseph Roach's notion of the deep 18th century, as many others thinking about fame and celebrity do. This approach underlines how the long-running performances that began in the late 1600s or early 1700s are still going, connecting the court of Charles II to our present moment, which just happens to be the court of Charles III. Today, then, I'll be tracing Salisbury and her many textual appearances from her birth through our present moment. Though not involved in the theater herself, I will talk about these materials via 3 acts. Act 1, covering early, faint archival traces. Act 2, from stabbing to textual explosion. Act 3, after her death through the 1890s. Then we'll finish with an epilogue touching on prostitute narrative scholarship starting in the 1990s into our present moment. First, though, I want to show you a quick chronology of Salisbury's life and related print works, both before and after her death. I don't have time to talk about all the very cool things that I found in my research of Salisbury in 30 minutes, but I am quite happy to do so during Q&A if you see anything that piques your curiosity. So Salisbury was born Sarah Briton and became a prostitute likely by the time she was 14, working for Mother Wiseborn. She also likely worked for Madam Mrs. Needham. Salisbury's list of possible clients over her career is very, very long, and I cannot sum it up more than that. She became the center of a print explosion after non-fatally stabbing the Honorable John Finch. She was arrested and sentenced to a year in prison. By the time she died in 1724, she was already the subject of a broadsheet, 2 true long-form biographies, neither authorized, at least 1 pirated serial in the London Post, multiple songs and mezzotints, not listed here for considerations of space, an Old Bailey trial account, and used as an instrument of political satire, and Pasquin, a pro-Whig serial. After her death in prison in 1724, Salisbury appeared again in another biography, which is another reworking of Walker's authentic memoirs. She also appeared in the Briton, another pro-Whig serial, in multiple versions of the Newgate Calendar. In September 1747, her remains were part of a massive coffin robbery and used as a touchstone for reportage, along with Dr. Henry Sacheverell, a controversial Tory clergyman. She then reappeared in multiple 19th-century periodicals, and her biographies became touchstones for scholarship on the 18th-century prostitute narratives in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Again, ephemeral and strangely durable. So we have a definition of celebrity as refillable and ephemeral, usually put into contrast with the durability of fame. Both celebrity and fame provide ways to understand reputation, creation, and transmission, particularly as related to print media. As I will show, Sally Salisbury fits this definition of celebrity and also breaks it. So here is basically the only trace I found of Salisbury printed before the whole stabbing thing. In 1719, she is described as a noted lady of pleasure who is setting up a chariot with a coachman and 2 footmen. This line item in the original weekly journal is just one of many snippets of news listed as coming from London that week, including the Duke of Newcastle's movements, for example. Salisbury's domestic arrangements are directly followed by news of a 70-year-old man committing suicide and the results of the most recent Old Bailey court sessions. So here we have evidence of her temporary celebrity as a noted lady of pleasure that is made somewhat durable by being printed in a paper that just happened to be saved. So for Act 2, which takes us from the stabbing of Finch until her death in prison, this next period in Salisbury's record shows how print culture, especially when we think of newspapers and other periodicals as social media, accelerates the breakdown of neat divisions between celebrity and fame. The fact that we have no direct example of Salisbury's own words, this will come up again. Everything we have supposedly from her is mediated through, well, men, honestly. This further demonstrates the lack of personal control over one's reputation, particularly as others explicitly look to profit from it. First off, the stabbing itself, gloriously illustrated here in a later edition of the Newgate Calendar. On September 22nd, 1722, Sally Salisbury and John Finch were at the 3-Ton Tavern in Covent Garden. It's about 2 a.m., and there is some kind of argument between them about Finch giving an opera ticket to Salisbury's sister. You see, this virtually educated sister wasn't supposed to be at the opera, according to Salisbury, partly to avoid an unnamed gentleman who was pursuing this sister. Of course, these reasons in later retellings turned into just jealousy, setting Salisbury into a passionate rage. She stabbed Finch between the 3rd and 4th rib, so it was definitely a close one. But doctors were called, Finch patched up. In the process, Finch forgives Salisbury. They make up, they kiss. He was taken back to his home by Salisbury herself, where he eventually made a full recovery. As promised, only non-fatal stabbings in this talk. But this stabbing does set off a quick flurry of print. To start, we've got some 18th century clickbait where the title aims to get your attention, but the content does not match up. So this poem clearly wants to exploit Salisbury's notoriety to show copies. And sell. Laura Rosenthal mentions the ghastly wound, a tale, in passing as something connected to Salisbury, but doesn't go much further. It's advertised in the Postboy and London Journal, where this advertisement is from. The poem itself is held at the Beinecke Library at Yale. There are no scans. And, spoiler alert, it has nothing to do with Salisbury or even stabbing someone. But if you want to hear how a cavernous vagina scares off a devil, you should definitely check it out. Of course, most of the print objects trying to capitalize on Salisbury's newfound appeal actually talk about her. We've got the move to establish an authoritative narrative via a broadsheet biography, printed shortly after her arrest. Then comes a longer form crowdsourced biography by Captain Charles Walker. So here Walker advertises in the Postboy, a popular newspaper that came out 3 times a week, and he advertises for weeks, asking men to send any useful particulars toward perpetuating the memory of Salisbury. This first call for submissions, printed in the January 8 to 10 issue of 1723, is printed less than 2 weeks after Salisbury's arrest. The next week, the book appears in advertisements as now in press, and it is published with engraved frontispiece, as far as I can tell through newspaper advertisements, around the 18th of March, 1723. So the quick publication of this book, under 90 days from initial advertisement to publication, Walker himself attributes to the impatience of the public, while he lays the groundwork for a second volume that never appears. Walker's authentic memoirs basically becomes the touchstone for all biographical work about Salisbury that comes afterwards. The text is largely made up of letters received in response to this call for papers. There are 18 letters from 12 contributors, named, initialed, and anonymous, plus a poem from distressed females at Bridewell Prison, and Walker's narrative sections, conclusion, and a dedicatory epistle written to Salisbury. Authentic memoirs attempts to fix Salisbury's reputation and narrative, with Walker's own mock heroic epistle comparing her to classical era prostitutes and apparently lauding her many, shall we say, accomplishments. So not only does Walker's text attempt to set the basis for Salisbury's enduring fame, it becomes a vehicle to show the reiterative power of celebrity in print media. The London Post starts a thinly disguised, pirated, serialized reprint of Walker's narrative in their March 20th to 23rd, 1723 edition. It's a lot of 20s. Mere days after the book is published. Notice how this serial swaps out Walker's title, Authentic Memoirs of the Life, for The Surprising Life, Intrigues, etc. Instant difference. Totally changed. Then we have a later text where part of Walker's narrative is turned into content about a completely different person. So this 1728 supposed biography of Anne Rochford, the Velvet Coffee Woman, has a funeral oration, highlighted here, that directly copies Walker's own dedicatory epistle, just shifting the pronouns from second to third person. Markham Ellis points out how this supposed biography likely recycles other identified content, showing yet again how materials connected to Salisbury remediate in unexpected places and demonstrate the refillability of her narrative. So while Walker and these biographies demonstrate one attempt to control Salisbury's narrative, Pasquin shows another method to leverage Salisbury's newsworthiness, turning her into a political mouthpiece. This pro-Whig, so pro-government, serial prints a supposed letter exchange between Salisbury and Frank Rigg, which is the name used in Jacobite ciphers for failed Jacobite rebellion leader Francis Atterbury, Bishop of Rochester and Dean of Westminster. Salisbury's letter appears on April 8th in 1723, explaining how, since they are both in jail, they should connect because they have so much in common. Frank's response on April 19th satirizes Atterbury much more than Salisbury. Salisbury's part of this exchange even shows up in Ireland. There is a May 1723 Dublin reprint of this so-called letter, but this document's connection to Pasquin appears nowhere on the page or in the British Library's records today, at least not yet. So to wrap up examples from this time of print explosion, I have 3 more from 1723 of how print both fixes and destabilizes Salisbury's reputation during her lifetime: a trial account, a long-form biography, and the introduction to Jane Barker's Patchwork Screen for Ladies. So the Old Bailey trial account fixes the facts of the case. It is printed separately from the regular general proceedings. Yet again, however, there is no direct testimony from Salisbury. Her counsel speaks for her. Most of this 8-page document, and you can see the first and last 2 pages here, gives the prosecution's case, including the deposition of 3 Ton Tavern's tavern drawer, Joseph Thrope, and barkeeper Mrs. Ditton, plus the surgeon Mr. Colhart, who attended to Finch. The opera ticket and Salisbury's fear for her sister's virtue as the triggering event of the whole stabbing debacle comes up in this testimony. Meanwhile, the defense's case does not show up until page 7. The defense mostly contests the charge that Salisbury meant to kill John Finch and calls several witnesses, unnamed, to give evidence of Salisbury's character, intimacy, and friendship with Finch. This document would seem to be the closest thing we have to historical facts, but it still withholds plenty of details. The anonymous, genuine history of Mrs. Sarah Briton, usually called Sally Salisbury, and her gallants, fractures and contests Walker's narrative, marking discourses about Salisbury as worth debate. This text presents a more sentimentalized version of her story, with events in roughly chronological order. Genuine history reads like a morality tale, with a static, bad-tempered Salisbury at its center. Again, we have no indication that Salisbury participated in this work, and yet it circulates just fine without her. Lastly, Jane Barker's introduction to her A Patchwork Screen for Ladies, a collection of stories and poems, fully destabilizes Sally by treating her as a fictional character, discussing those whose histories at large are so fashionable. Barker lists Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, and Colonel Jack, all protagonists of popular fictions written by Daniel Defoe, with Salisbury as the final example of the many heroes and heroines that abound in this kind of novel. History, of course, in this period means both a made-up story and the recounting of fact, but Salisbury has become a signifier for a completely different kind of type, a fictional heroine. So Salisbury dies in February 1724, just a few months before the end of her prison sentence. She dies of some kind of venereal disease, jail fever, or distemper, depending on the source. Now no longer alive, one would think her celebrity would fade away, just maybe, while some hints of fame endure. However, this third act proceeds to demonstrate celebrity's durability and fame's ephemerality, breaking down the distinctions we discussed at the start of this presentation and laying bare how reputation transmission operates in unexpected ways. So for one, there's another version of Walker's authentic memoirs published pretending to be something new. This one is called A Complete History of the Life, Intrigues, and Death of that celebrated lady of pleasure. Its subtitle even promises to set forth how she came to be famous among the quality. See, she's famous. It says so right there. Okay, to be fair, the anonymous A Complete History does more than just repackage Walker's text as a direct narrative, taking out all the framing of letters. It also adds the Old Bailey trial transcript account afterwards, and then talks about Salisbury's death at the end. So all your Salisbury needs in one small volume. Here it is above the second edition of Walker's text. I took this picture at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, which is the only place that holds this. Thank you to them for that time. And you can notice the cruder woodcut and smaller page size of this reprint versus Walker's original with its engraving. So the first ripple of this wave of durable celebrity, though, really shows up in the Briton, yet another anti-Jacobite political periodical. This is where it gets interesting or complicated, depending on what you're interested in. See, the Briton started in reaction to the periodical pamphlet The True Briton, begun by Philip, Duke of Wharton, after he defended Francis Atterbury. Remember Francis from Pasquin? Frank Rigg, that guy? So the Duke of Wharton defended Atterbury in a speech, and then he starts The True Briton. Wharton's True Briton ended on February 17th, 1724, and this penultimate issue of The Briton from February 19th mourns 3 memorable persons whom we have lately lost: Mrs. Sally Salisbury, a city poet, and the True Briton. Remember, Salisbury died on February 11th. So while Salisbury once again becomes a method to mock a Jacobite, the half-sheet folio page of coverage gives a brief sketch of her life the ending paragyric pointing to her possible connection with Wharton, a well-known rake himself. To wit, she is not proud, but affable and easy of access, a well-wisher to the church, but not ostentatious of religion, a great encourager of the liberal sciences, a lover of mankind and champagne. The next ripple is the coffin robbery, which is probably the real reason that you're all here. I totally get it. It's fine. It's a safe space. So there was a massive coffin robbery in September 1747 at the Church of St. Andrew's, Holborn, which is, ironically, right down the street from the Old Bailey Criminal Court. They are less than a quarter mile apart. 5 men, including the sexton and gravedigger, stole 150 coffins for their lead out of the vault. The Gentleman's Magazine reports the arrest of these men, naming 2 coffins in particular that had been violated, that of Dr. Henry Sacheverell and that of Sally Salisbury. This, in fact, is not the only time the clergyman and sex worker have been yoked together, as suggestive epigrams about them perhaps being buried together in the vault attest. I mean, they did die only a few months apart. Who knows? But this is where celebrity starts to show its durability, because Sacheverell had been a well-known, even controversial mover and shaker in political and religious contexts. He came to a wider public notice with a sermon on November 5th, 1709, so it makes sense that a robbery that disturbs his body, also St. Andrew's was his church, by the way, so this would mention him as a figure and the wider public would recognize over 20 years later. Where then does that leave Salisbury? Is she famous? A celebrity? Neither? Both? Allow me to take us forward in time to 1875. It's been well over 150 years since Salisbury's death. And here she is, right in the middle of the Athenaeum's literary gossip, a collection of miscellaneous line items with information like Robert Browning has given a new poem to his publishers. In this context appears this short blurb about the fate of Sacheverell's coffin and Sally Salisbury's. She is described as a notorious courtesan whose manes were honored by multiple biographies. Just as a side note, while notorious denotes both fame and infamy, Sacheverell here gets described as celebrated, the epithet most associated with Salisbury in the 1720s. Manes, of course, references the spirits of the dead, worthy of homage and reverence. While it is unclear if this description is biting or sincere, here Salisbury signifies the writer's knowledge of history, hints of scandalous delight, and also perhaps acts as a marker of credibility. Salisbury shows up in other 19th century periodicals too, and proves to be just as durable as her clergyman companion in death. For example, she takes over a thread. It helps to think of notes and queries as like an early form of Reddit, I find, that begins giving information about why Sacheverell wasn't buried in his church. This is just a line item submitted to Notes and Queries in 1890. The responses demand better citation of the original writer's sources. It seems most unlikely, says this writer, that so large a number could have been stolen. But then the responses take a sharp turn into inquiries all about Salisbury and other Sallys of the 18th century. After 5 issues have this query thread, which is still labeled Dr. Sacheverell, it seems to stop. But again, Salisbury proves to be of more interest than the Reverend. I want to leave plenty of time for questions, so I will just note here 3 other arenas where Salisbury continues to appear. The first is images. We have mezzotints by John Smith that are reprinted for decades by Bowles. We also have woodcuts and other engravings with captions that I have found so far in English, German, and Dutch. We also have the Newgate Calendar, where Salisbury appears in at least 3 of the 5 major editions. There is still much research to be done here, but there are many, many Newgate Calendar variants. And then we also have ballads. And honestly, for every attempt that someone says this is or that song is about Salisbury, someone else says it's actually about a different Sally or Sarah. So I have left that alone for now. But who knows what the future holds. Skipping forward another century or so, Salisbury is definitely a core figure in scholarship about 18th century prostitution and prostitute narrative starting in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Most of this early work compares the narrative aims of Walker's authentic memoirs with the anonymous genuine history, with occasional references to the effigies broadsheet. I, for one, couldn't have done this work without the scholarship and effort of people like Tony Henderson, Vivia Jones, Bradford Mudge, Lena Olson, Patrick Spedding, Markham Ellis, Anne Marie Lewis, Sharon Smith, Chloe Wigston Smith, and Lauren Rosenthal, as well as many other scholars, too numerous to list here, who were working on texts about other 18th century sex workers. These recovery efforts once again highlight the durable fame and temporary celebrity of figures across the 1700s, now refracted 300 years later, as we continue perhaps older strands of reputation transmission or seek to correct cultural memory via forgotten histories. We today, of course, have plenty of examples of the ephemeral, refillable, yet also famous, but for how long, across even more media channels than in the 1720s. Reputations are created, commodified, influenced, manipulated, supported by clicks and algorithms and likes and sharing and whatever else the apps are doing today that I don't yet know about. The necessity of having multiple kinds of information and multiple kinds of knowledge to paint a complete picture has never been clearer, as information fractures and multiplies at an alarming rate, which, let's be honest, always feels alarming because it is always faster than before, no matter the era we're discussing. As we get ready to head into the Q&A, I want to consider how we all profit from the sharing of other people's stories. People have profited from Salisbury's story financially, of course, since her arrest back in the December of 1722. But as scholars and students of history, we also want something from these narratives as we study and parse and track down records of people who maybe were on everyone's lips and maybe no one had ever heard of. Our internet-driven media landscape quite obviously makes money from our attention as the stories of others are shared way beyond their own control or permission to generate clicks, ad revenue, and capture our eyeballs. Engagement, you see, equals money for today's internet. These narratives fuel our hot takes, reposts, and even just casual conversation. I clearly cannot get enough of Salisbury's story and its remediations galore, but I also know that the archive will never yield her authentic or genuine or complete histories, no matter how many special collections I visit, articles I read, or strange footnotes I track down. Because the real Sally Salisbury, whoever she was, remains in just one of the many inaccessible archival gaps we can never truly fill despite her fame. Thank you.
Sorry, I was so busy clapping that I forgot to unmute to invite everyone to thank Bethany for a brilliant whirlwind through the life and afterlife of Sally Salisbury, which was great. And while people are putting together their questions and thoughts, I just want to share a quick anecdote from teaching yesterday. I had students working on Lavinia Fenton, who's a similar celebrity figure who mostly circulated in the absence of her real body, and noting that the publications written about Fenton were uncannily similar to the comments section of Kim Kardashian's Instagram. That a lot of the same language and the same tropes, particularly about breasts and bottoms, were being replicated, so that very deep 18th century is very much with us. So lots of praise and joy running through the chat section. I'd like to open things up for questions. You can use the raise hand function or type a question into the chat. So Julia and Louise and Kirsten and many others have all commented that your paper is fascinating, brilliant, and enthralling, and many other adjectives. Maddie, you'd like to unmute and share your question?
First of all, thanks, Bethany, for such an interesting talk. My question, I was really interested in your discussion of fame and how that was such a nebulous concept back then. What I was thinking during your talk was that someone like Sally Salisbury, who was at the center of this true crime narrative, today we describe her as infamous rather than just famous. Was there a concept of infamy back then? Would there have been a difference in that? Is there a reason why she was described as famous rather than infamous?
Yeah, thanks, Addie. That's a great question. So infamy, yes, definitely existed in the before times. But the reason infamous does show up sometimes connected to Salisbury. The reason I don't use it is because of its moral valence that is built into it. Because when you say someone's infamous, that usually means they're bad or famous for a bad reason. So as I was prepping this talk, I was talking to some of my fine colleagues about, to build on Elaine, the Kardashians, and how the Kardashians are famous and celebrities and infamous all at once, and commodified and commodifying. And so there's just a lot of that circulation. But yeah, it is true that she would be infamous. And I do love thinking about this as a true crime narrative where no one actually dies, which is very different than a lot of true crime narrative consumed today, or in the past, to be frank. And how she doesn't get arrested for prostitution. That's not why she goes to court. It's because she stabs this guy. And then, that's not seen as a cool thing. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Julia had a question.
Thank you.
Sorry, Maddie. Julia?
To say there are so many printed accounts of her life, and thank you again, it's a really, really good paper. Are the versions of her life in these printed accounts very different, very inconsistent, and does that mean that a lot of them were made up? What's your deduction from that?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. There are some consistent things that happen. One of them is a story where she is seen in the street and someone thinks she's a fine lady, and then it's like, haha, tricked you. I'm a whore, like kind of thing. There is a story that gets repeated of her being inverted and her lady parts filled with gold coins as people try to toss them inside, which is a good time. So again, it is unclear. Some of these stories show up in later prostitute narratives too. Kitty Fisher eating, I think it's I forget what note it is that Kitty Fisher makes a sandwich out of and eats to show how rich she is. Salisbury does a similar move. So I think one of the things that is so the Walker crowdsourced thing, and then the genuine history, the authentic memoirs, and then there's the anonymous genuine history. And the anonymous one really reworks a lot of the things in Walker and makes Salisbury like a much less appealing person, I would say. So I'm sure there are other things out there too, but the stories range from like, she totally ripped me off, and she's awful, to, oh my God, she's amazing and everyone should go and visit her. So there's a whole range. They're very fun. Like they're a fun read if you are looking for something entertaining, I would say.
So Karen, do you want to share your comment, your question?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Bethany. This was so interesting and thought-provoking. I wonder if Walker's contributors were named. I wonder if there's any sort of a room for a meta commentary about who the contributors were to this crowdsourced document.
Some of them are named, and the easiest to access copy is actually standing underneath the thing holding up my notes right now. So I can't just pull it out very easily. But some of them are anonymous, some of them are just initials. some of them have clear pseudonyms. One of them is a Captain Smith. I'm not going to try and track down a Captain Smith in the 1720s because even I know my limits. So one of the some of the meta commentary that has been made is, some scholars have seen this conceit as just a conceit that Walker made up everything and just pretended that it came from other sources. However, now that, again, I want to acknowledge that as a scholar, like, I have been able to access a lot more stuff online than one could get hold of easily in the early 2000s. Yeah, definitely Soren. It was totally a James Smith. So easy to find, very, very unique. So, I can look through the copies of the London Post and the Post Boy and stuff. And so I have found where Walker's first ad acknowledges the receipt of the first letter from JS, and then another advertisement like responds to somebody else who submitted a story, and then actually in the text, clearly the letters from two guys were like swapped so the other ones could read them, and then they respond to each other. So if this is all a conceit, like, it's very complicated in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense to me personally. And so, I really, when I wrote about this in the dissertation, I thought a lot more about how the coffee house acts as a place of commodification. And so here you have a man taking other men's stories to sell back to other men about a prostitute out of a coffee house. He's working out of a coffee house. That's where you send everything. Really showing this like refined, Enlightenment discourse. We only talk about literature thing that isn't actually happening, right? The coffee houses are full of puke and sex and gambling and other things, as well as political machinations. So I know I got a little excited there, but yeah, there has been some effort to try and track down some of these named contributors, but a lot of them are just, JS, who probably is a John Smith, because again, easy to find.
Thanks, so fascinating.
Kirsten Saxon has in the chat, and she's asked you to elaborate on the things you said you didn't have time to elaborate with. And if I can add a request to that, if you can start with the mezzotints and the kind of the problems of illustrating famous beauties.
Yes, I definitely can. In fact, I just happen to have some mezzotints in a presentation to show you, because I love the mezzotints. So this is the one we started with. And then we also have this smaller version that's clearly pulled from the larger 3/4 pose. And so this is one of the oil paintings of a countess, you may recall, that is clearly an inspiration for this image. Here is the mezzotint of the countess. Here are details from the Salisbury and the oil painting. So we have the same jewel situation at the breast. Then we have this other painting of Lucy Manners, who is a duchess, that turns into a mezzotint. And then we have the flower is basically the same. And so, one of these is a duchess and one of these is a prostitute, supposedly. You tell me which is which with not a label. And then we also have etchings and things like this. But with the mezzotints, what's really cool is that, or really cool is a lame way to say it, but anyway, so Bowles, the printer, advertises Sally Salisbury. There's like a list of like large women's heads mezzotints. And so there's a list from 1728. And then again, she's still there in 1753 in this catalog of like mezzotints that you could buy. And the other women there are, some queens and some duchesses and some royal ladies and a couple actresses. And so the list grows, but like she's still you don't advertise things you don't sell. So she's still newsworthy, buy worthy. People would still maybe want to buy her 30 years after her death. So that is a fun time. Yeah, and there's yeah, this like again, Kevin Burke has a really great piece in 18th Century Studies from a couple years ago about how mezzotints of Kitty Fisher and then later sex workers get recycled. Literally, it's the same image, but they just changed the name at the bottom. And so this use, and Soren, who is here as well, has done really good work about this refillability and how mezzotint as a technology circulates, which is pretty great. So I would highly recommend checking that out.
And labeling. I'm just thinking of all the oil paintings of a vaguely hot chick that just has Nell Gwyn stuck on it in the 19th century to make it a more saleable commodity.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things actually prepping this, so like just this week, there is a catalog of a miniature of a exhibition of miniatures in like Kensington something in the mid 1800s. And there are two enameled miniatures that are supposedly of Salisbury and her daughter. And I found out about this because somebody writes in to Notes and Queries and is like, who's Sally of Salisbury? And like has other questions about people they saw at this exhibition. So that led me into a very short diversion into trying to track down 18th century enameled portraits, which is a whole world out there. And again, there's a lot of just like woman in blue dress. And they all kind of look vaguely weird and vaguely the same. So who knows? If that's something that you know more about, I would love to talk to you about it. Please. Thank you.
Daniela.
Hi, that was fantastic, Bethany. I also came, not surprisingly, to ask about the images, but and you know, the problem of these sort of presumed Salisbury's sort of circulating that sort of any womanness, and I'm struck here by the difference between the any womanness and this concept as others have discussed of sort of refillable faces, and the specific emulation of duchesses and countesses. And I wonder how that juxtaposition sort of being both functions to me in different ways. And I wonder sort of what your take on that is, and if you might say something about that.
Sure. Thanks, Daniela. Yeah, I mean, I think that the easiest place to go is that these are both kinds of public women. And if you're a public woman, you're usually seen as sexually available, whether or not you are. And so I think there is something about, I mean, yeah, we could, there's a lot of things about like the It Girl. I mean, this is what Joseph Roach's book, which is great. Again, It, fabulous read if you have not read it. He talks about basically the it factor and what makes people attractive, or have this sort of thing that makes you want to know more about them. And so, yeah, that's something I've been thinking a lot about, is like public and private, you know, quite aren't really as maybe divided as we'd like to think they are, anyway, but how whose images are allowed to be circulated, totally disconnected from who they actually are. And like, again, as you probably know all too well, portraits of people also don't necessarily look like them that are oil paintings, or sketches or anything, because, well, you know, where you don't want to be too true to life all the time. So yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear more if you have other places or ideas of where to go with that.
If there's no other question that I'm usurping, I would love to ask a part two, be that person.
Ask away. The floor is yours.
I guess my question is sort of, for me, as an art historian, I think about the patronage of oil paintings very differently than I think about the patronage and collectability of mezzotint portraits, right? And so mezzotint for its own sake, so to speak, versus mezzotint after an oil painting reads differently for me. And I think that might be productive to think about further.
Yeah, and that sounds great. And I agree. I think that sounds like a very smart thing. One of the things that I have tried to do to keep the project manageable is I have only looked at printed items. And so like I looked at oil paintings when I was trying to track down these other mezzotints as a sort of an text, but like yeah, I think you're right. Yes, I agree. And I would love to get more into that and see if there are other mezzotints in the archive that look like Salisbury or look like these other women as well, and sort of constellate that into some sort of thinking about image circulation.
We have any last questions for Bethany before I steal chair's privilege again? Okay, I want to bring us back to the coffin robbery because, coffin robbery, it's cool. And I was thinking about the pairing of Sacheverell and Salisbury, kind of the actress and the bishop, right? We got the two ends of who might be buried there, and wondering if the kind of posthumous fame and that the kind of the second act that she, or third act in your version, is a way of being a type, rather that she's standing in for the good time girl as the opposite of the stern vicar. Sorry, that wasn't a very good question, but I'm just trying to think about why that pairing was so repeated and so powerful.
Thank you again. I know some people have to leave because they have to go things like teach, but thank you again for coming to everyone. I really appreciate you being here. Yeah, I mean, it is a trope. So that is one of the other things about celebrity, is that we have these refillable figures of, the sexy girl and the priestly dude. And the epigram about the coffins is, "Lo, to one grave consigned of rival fame, a reverend doctor and a wanton dame. Well for the world both did to rest retire, for each while living set mankind on fire." Which I just think is great. There's also, it's totally tarts and vicars, but before times. There's also this really interesting anecdote, to go back to Julia's question about things that are in the record, of her like debating with a dissident and a non-dissident preacher about like which way is better and like what religious tradition she should belong to. And so it's very interesting because according to that, she actually has like Jacobite leanings. But then all these political satire publications that are using her to make fun of Jacobites. So like there's records of both. And, I had to go and like understand Whigs and Tories again for the 18th time and be like, wait, so who's on third? It's very like, okay, so there's, but yeah, I think it's a tale as old as time, right? Everyone loves a sexy girl and a priest, or loves sexy priests, as Fleabag shows us. So yeah.
Right, so we've achieved the legend of Sally Salisbury, who lingers long and whose coffin may or may not have been refillable after the lead was stolen. Have we got any last words before we just thank Bethany heartily for her time? Scintillating, great, engaging. We've got lots more adjectives piling up. If we don't have a final question, can I ask you all to join me once again in a round of applause, virtual or not? And thank you again for joining us at ODSECS, and hope to see you in December for our final talk of 2023.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.